Hi everyone, this is F1 Black, and on Georgie's Stripping the Dipping podcast this week, we welcome Tom Brown of Blackbook Motorsport. What's Blackbook Motorsport, you ask? Well, it's an exclusive business community for senior level decision makers in the international motor racing industry, which makes Blackbook's partnerships executive, Tom Brown, the perfect person to discuss Liberty Media's recent buyout of MotoGP, Indycar's first non-championship $1 million challenge, and the commercial ramifications of Lewis Hamilton leaving Mercedes and what it means for the likes of Puma, Tommy Hilfiger and Adidas. So without further ado, Tom, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me.
Well, welcome, and yeah, it's our pleasure. So Tom, if you were introducing yourself to someone new, i.e. our listeners, how would you go about doing that? Who's Tom Brown?
It's a good question. So I guess I would say that my name's Tom. I am 30, living in London, and I have always been very keen on my motorsport, and more recently have managed to align my career into being also in motorsport, which has been a little bit of an adventure. But yeah, I would say that outside of that, I'm a big fan of London in general. I enjoy London's pubs. I enjoy a bit of history. I'm a football fan. So yeah, hopefully that's enough to get going with.
Yeah, there's plenty to get going there. I'm intrigued about London pubs, so we might have to delve into that in a bit, see if we have some pubs in common. But it sounds like, as you say, prior to the adventure of getting into motorsport, you were a fan. So what would you say your first memory is of motorsport? How far back does it go?
So I would say my first memory, particularly first memory of watching motorsport live, and forgive me if this is quite a niche, not niche, but very specific example, is the overtake from Mika Hakkinen on Michael Schumacher at Spa in, I want to say 2000, where he went either side of the back marker down at the end of the Kemmel Straight. So I'm hoping that rings a few bells. That's the first any form of motorsport that I can remember watching live and being really kind of excited by, because at the time it was a pretty iconic overtake. And so, yeah, very specific, I appreciate, but that's my first memory.
You don't need to be sort of ashamed of that. And doing a bit of quick maths, if you're 30, possibly going on 31 this year, you were about 6 or 7 when that happened. So, fair play to your
Exactly
memory.
right, yeah.
Yeah, and that specificity. And it was an iconic overtake. I'm trying to remember. There were a few other sort of overtaker back marker and the leader overtakes, but I don't think there's been anything as you say, as iconic as that. So at the time, were you particularly supporting either one of those drivers, or did you find yourself through your childhood picking a driver that you've followed through?
So, and I think this probably goes for a lot of motorsport fans, particularly F1 fans. I've definitely been someone that's followed drivers more than teams. And certainly the first driver that I can remember supporting was Mika Hakkinen. So that overtake in particular made 6-year-old me very happy. So I think, yeah, it was Hakkinen in the early days, and then that followed through to Raikkonen when he joined McLaren as well. I don't know what it was about the Finns when I was a child, but must have been something about them that made me want to support them and root for them.
I mean, it was quite a natural or neat transition, the kind of Hakkinen to Raikkonen one. And I don't want to say you're a bad luck charm, Tom, but by that point, Hakkinen was a double world champion, and not long after you started watching him, he went into that retirement. We still hope to see him back on the grid one day, or so the meme says. Is Formula One, would you say, your favourite series, or have you gotten into other series over the years?
I definitely have. I mean, I think I would have to say F1 is my favourite just because it's the one that I've watched for the longest period of time. And, ever since I can remember watching any sort of sport, F1 has always been a part of that. I used to go and watch a fair amount of British touring cars when I was younger with my dad and my brother. So I think that was probably my first experience of live motorsport, which was pretty cool as a kid. More recently, I would say, and Kian in particular, my colleague at Blackbook, teases me a little bit about this because I went to Le Mans last year and came back saying that World Endurance Championship was my favourite championship. But I will say that it is probably second at the moment behind F1 because I think it's got an awful lot going for it, both on track and off track. So if not F1, then right now I'd say World Endurance Championship.
At least you didn't say WEC to start, so fair enough. I mean, we'll give you credit for that. And yeah, World Endurance Championships had and has some sort of interesting racing drivers in it. I must admit, I'm probably similar to you in the sense that Formula One was certainly the thing that attracted me to motorsport, and most things that I've watched since have been adjacent to that. You talked about an adventure, I suppose, to get to work in motorsport or around international motor racing. So can you tell us a bit about that? Because we've got listeners that are, I don't know, of all ages, but certainly some are looking at dipping their toes in professionally. How did you go from being that child that loved motorsport to, what you're doing today and getting into Blackbook? What was your story there?
Well, I would say first and foremost, I never really considered working in motorsport, particularly going through university and even kind of the earlier part of my career. It was something that I was always had an interest in, but it wasn't something that I was ever really switched on to thinking about how I could necessarily work in. That's something that came much more recently. So I actually worked after leaving university and moving to London. I worked for 6 or 7 years in a completely different industry in media, working for a company that owned outdoor advertising space and working on the teams that would fundamentally responsible for selling that space to advertisers, billboards, posters, that sort of thing. And then it was only in the more recent kind of last couple of years or so, maybe 2.5 years, that I started to feel like I wanted a little bit of a change and started to think about motorsport first and foremost, and tried to work at how I could move from one industry into the other with all of the challenges that faces whenever you do I suppose, a pretty significant career change. But so yeah, it was quite a slow burn. Like, until I was probably 27, 28, didn't really consider about working in motorsport, and then it's something that has happened a little bit more recently.
No, I can imagine, and it sounds like not only have you been successful, but it hasn't come easily, and you've had to think, quite intelligently about how you make that transition. So before we launch much further in, could you tell our listeners a bit more about Black Book? So what is Black Book? What is it trying to achieve?
Yeah, of course. So Blackbook, as you very rightly said during your introduction, we fundamentally exist to be the business community for the global motorsport industry. So there's lots of different parts of the industry, whether it's F1, Indycar, NASCAR, MotoGP, all of these worlds, and a lot of the businesses within them, whether they be circuits, teams, sponsors, they operate generally very independently of each other, and there's surprisingly little kind of cross-industry communication or cross-pollination, I suppose you could say. So Blackbook's role is we work with businesses across all different types of motorsport, whether they be series, teams, brands, suppliers, circuits, and ultimately we are the place and the platform where they can meet each other and build relationships across the industry for whatever purpose they're looking to do that. So that's our role kind of behind the scenes in the industry. If anyone Googles Blackbook or goes on our LinkedIn or our website or whatever it may be, they will see that we are the front of that is that we are a daily news source for everything concerned with the business of global motorsport. So whether that's in the commercial world, whether that's broadcast, sustainability, diversity and inclusion, all of these areas that affect everything happening away from the circuit, we are the source of that daily news and content and interviews. And then that role we play in really connecting the industry as best we can is what sits behind that.
Fantastic. And I mean, your job title, not that this is an interview or anything, is well, a job interview. It is an interview. It is partnerships executive. So, I mean, what does that mean in practice, and what do you find yourself doing from day to day?
So it fundamentally revolves around that community that I mentioned. So there's lots of businesses that we work with that are part of that business community, and we organize networking events, conferences. We'll introduce businesses directly to each other, run our own virtual networking sessions, all of this sort of thing. And my role is to work alongside our director in making sure that that all functions as well as it can do, both in terms of existing relationships and businesses that we have and making sure that they get access to all of these events, that we're facilitating the introductions that they're looking for. And then similarly, when it comes to speaking to businesses out there in the industry that may not know about Blackbook and who we are and what we do, and educating them and bringing them into the fold as well. So that's the main responsibility of my role. There's a few other bits and pieces, as ever, that you kind of dip in and out of now and again. But yeah, that's the core of it, I'd say.
It makes sense. And before we sort of talk about a few sort of, I guess, motorsport business stories, I'm intrigued to hear in that experience as a partnership executive, as a motorsports fan, have you had any sort of pinch yourself moments or sort of things that you thought, wow, that's pretty cool when you sort of zoom out in the middle of a situation?
It's a very good question. I mean, one thing I would say, and this we may come back to this a little bit later, is it's not necessarily easy being a fan working in the professional environment because ultimately you're there to be a professional first and foremost. So there are, there's times where you do have to maybe take a step back and detach a little bit from what's going on around you to make sure that you're remaining that professional and calm and or ultimately doing the job that you're there to do. So there's been a few kind of a few moments here and there where I've thought to myself, this is a pretty cool thing to be doing with my day. But it's as ever with any role, I think in any whether it's motorsport or other sports, people often see what is perhaps posted on LinkedIn or socials or whatever, or they assume that everybody working in F1 is flying around to 20 races a season and sitting in the paddock club. That's absolutely not the case for everybody. There's a lot of hard work that goes on behind that as well, for sure.
You're just saying that so that I don't apply for your job. I completely understand that, but, yeah, it's champagne cocktails all day, isn't it? Surely, but there we are.
I'm afraid. Sorry to burst this bubble, but it's not quite that.
Yeah, this is definitely not what I signed up for. No, no, it does sound like hard work, and yeah, you're right. You're exhibiting all the signs of a fully functioning adult, whereas perhaps I wouldn't in those contexts. So congratulations.
Well, it's
So
very kind
what?
of you to say, I must.
Yeah, well, we haven't gone to the London pub yet.
Well, that's true.
So before we talk about London pubs, a few sort of stories that caught my eye over the weekend when I was thinking about this interview, and they have a kind of, I suppose, motorsport business feel. And I hope I get this right, but clearly the huge news in Formula One is Lewis Hamilton's move from Mercedes to Ferrari, and we're watching it in slow motion, I suppose. And Lewis Hamilton has a lot of sort of personal sponsors, and Mercedes have a lot of corporate sponsors, and there's sometimes overlap there. But we've just heard that Mercedes are losing Tommy Hilfiger, and they're also losing Puma, but they will be gaining Adidas next season, and there's a bit of a swap there. So, I mean, clearly that's some kind of partnership. I'm not trying to project onto you that this is what you do all day, but my question to you is sort of when it comes to a partnership, what makes a good one? And in this scenario, what are the sorts of calculations that will be going through people's minds? Puma thinking about leaving or Adidas thinking about joining. So tell us a bit more about what might be going on behind the scenes there.
So there's probably quite a lot to get into there because, as you rightly say, F1 in particular is one of the most globally commercial, globally successful commercial sports there is anywhere. And so all of these partners that are either involved in F1 or wanting to be involved in F1, there's a lot of decisions that have to be taken on both sides to make sure it's going to be an effective partnership, one that works for both. I think to touch on your point about Lewis Hamilton, I think clearly one would assume that Tommy Hilfiger leaving Mercedes, Lewis was definitely influential in bringing that partnership to the team, and one would expect it's one that he may well carry on at a personal level, as he's done with Monster and one or two others as well. So for a brand like Adidas to come in to support Mercedes from next year, I think it's definitely an interesting partnership. One thing that we have seen in F1 develop much more over the last few years is this increase in the breadth of brands that are involved in the sport. It's not that long ago that it was basically cigarette companies and that was basically it that was involved in Formula One. But in the last few years, apparel and clothing businesses have come much more to the forefront. We think of Castor, for example, with Red Bull, with McLaren, and almost every team on the grid now will have some sort of leisure wear, active wear partner. So it's no big surprise to see Adidas become involved, and equally probably not a huge surprise that they've opted for Mercedes, given that they are both two very very well respected and established German brands, probably two of the largest in the world in any sector, particularly as not to go off on too much of a tangent, but obviously it's been announced that Adidas are going to stop making the German national kits from, I think, 2027. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that therefore, leaves a pretty significant gap in their sports sponsorship portfolio. And clearly they see Mercedes as a brand and F1 as a sport that they want to fill that gap with. So I think there's a lot of decision making in terms of the fit of the two brands, perhaps more now than there ever has been. But I think in particular, the case of Adidas and Mercedes, I think that feels like quite a natural fit between the two.
You've got a kind of portfolio in your mind of sort of particular profiles, and Adidas are no longer supplying German football kit. I had no idea about that. So, I suppose that's you're looking at the sort of subtext and what's going on there. And I suppose if you were a Formula One team, you might be, before Adidas joined Mercedes, you might be looking at which leisure wear brands could enter the sport, i.e. they're not sponsoring a competitor, or as you say, they're pulling away from certain sports or entering other sports in a big way. My question to you here on this, which is, I'm quite a basic guy when it comes to sort of motorsport business. I think that, I put my name on your car, it gets on TV, in return, I give you some money. It's clearly much more sophisticated than that. So what if you're a partner of a Formula One team, what are the sorts of things you might be looking for?
So it's a very good question, and you're absolutely right. It is a little bit of a cliche that's used, but it's very much not the case anymore that brands just put a sticker on a car, hand over X million dollars, and that's the end of it. It has got a lot more complex. I think more and more so the fit between the two brands in terms of not just commercially, but also the values that they hold, some of the initiatives that they might be running away from the track is something that is becoming more and more important, because again, it's another well-used phrase, but purpose-driven partnerships are certainly coming to the fore much more, not just in F1 but in sports in general. So that is becoming definitely more of a consideration, I think, for brands looking to partner. As well, for the teams, it is a juggling act. F1 arguably has never been in a more successful commercial position as it is now. The teams are in profit. There's over 300 sponsors across the 10 teams on the F1 grid, which is a pretty mind-blowing number. And so they have to weigh up, realistically, when it comes to the partners they're bringing on board, what they can offer them, the assets that they have available, whether that's physically on the car, whether that's activating at races, whether that's, media time with the drivers, whatever it might be. It's a pretty complex balancing act now, especially if you look at the teams that have, the largest number of sponsors. I think McLaren is leading the way at the moment. They've got something mad like 52 sponsors across, F1 and their other series that they race in. So it's a real jigsaw, to fit those partners in, whilst of course then making sure that that brand, because they will be paying you a not insignificant amount of money, is getting the value that they are expecting as well.
Gosh, that's fascinating. That McLaren have perhaps one sixth of all partners in Formula One, but B, that Formula One teams are in profit, and I suppose that makes sense with the cost cap there as well. Not to get too economicsy on this, but do you see that
Please
sort of?
don't.
No. You're like, don't expose me. This is not on the question sheet. No, but just thinking out loud here. Would that, can that profit or that surplus last forever? Because I suppose Formula One is ultimately a competitive sport. Yes, of course, there is a huge business side to it. But if all the teams end up in profit, surely at some point they're going to knock on the door of the FIA or Liberty and say, come on, guys, we need to up the cost cap or something. Or do you think that they've been making losses for so many years that they might just want to? No one turns their nose up at money. They're happy to keep it as it is. What's your thought on that?
So I think, first of all, you're absolutely right. It is quite a recent phenomenon that any F1 teams, never mind. I mean, I'm not sure it's all the teams that are making profit, but certainly a reasonable number of them are. I think that was a comment that Zak Brown, the McLaren CEO, made a few weeks ago, is that now there's a reasonable number of teams on the grid that are in profit. That's only been the case for the last few years. And as you rightly mentioned, a big part of that is because of the cost cap that's come into F1, which was introduced by Liberty Media. So financially, the sport is more sustainable than it has been previously. It's not too long to think back 10, 12 years ago when there were 3 new teams that joined the grid and pretty quickly failed and ultimately went bust. So the teams, I think, are appreciating being in a more stable position. But with those budget caps in place, that does mean that the potential for profit is there. They can still bring in the sponsorship dollars. Only a limited amount of that money is being spent on development of the car itself, whereas in years gone by, they could have thrown all the money in the world at trying to make the car go as quick as they possibly could. So there's definitely a difference there. And it's one of the reasons why, the teams have been quite reticent when it comes to the Andretti bid, because the sport is in quite a good place financially, and they don't want to upset the apple cart too much with a potential 11th team that could kind of ruin the equilibrium, if you like, that they see they have at the moment. But yeah, I think the teams, there's a lot of potential for them at the moment to be in profit, and it's then a question of where that investment goes. If it's not going directly into the car, what other areas of those businesses does that investment go into?
No, it's a good point, and I guess what comes from what you're saying, and particularly the Andretti point, is I suppose the value of sort of brand partnerships in Formula One is some kind of function of global viewership plus sort of overall, I guess, brand value of the sport, and so I suppose a way that that surplus could be eaten away at is if that brand value and that viewership declines, if for some reason the sport becomes more or less competitive and a bit stagnant. But as you say, it seems at the moment that the sport is in rude health, commercially at least.
I think so, yeah. Certainly compared to where it was pre-Liberty, I think it's in a pretty good place. But it's a very good point you make. That will not necessarily last forever, and there's already a few little signs from the start of this season and even the back end of last season that because F1 has been not particularly competitive since the start of last season, with obviously Verstappen and Red Bull winning almost everything, that could have a knock-on impact in terms of viewership, and therefore, in terms of ultimately, if there's less eyeballs on the sport, there's going to be less appetite from brands and from partners to be involved. But I think we're a little way off that having a dramatic effect, but it's something that they'll need to certainly keep an eye on.
Absolutely. I suppose with all human nature, we tend to wait until it's slightly too late to react. But for now, we're the grasshopper enjoying the fruits of the summer, and we'll see. I don't know why I got so philosophical there. Okay, so speaking of competitive motorsports, across the pond in the US, of course, where Formula One would like to dominate, another single-seater series tends to be quite popular, although not as much as it used to be. IndyCar. And certainly there's a feeling there among, the whole sport that they're all trying to grow it together. And one innovative attempt that was made, I guess, a couple of weeks prior to the airing of the episode that you're listening to at the moment was the $1 million challenge, which was an exhibition race held by IndyCar at the Thermal Club in California. So it was a non-championship race. There was a lot of prize money on board, but it was held at a private members club. And I guess it says here in a gated community. So I guess, again, from your partnerships perspective, do you see this as potentially an emerging trend, like playing with the format, thinking about what makes the sport or, more attractive to a wider audience, finding partnerships in a private way as well? Do perhaps this is a big play on sprint racing, not sure. But yeah, do you see this to be the first of perhaps more of these sorts of partnerships in IndyCar, but more widely in motorsports?
I think my immediate response to that and the kind of quick answer is I hope not. And that's purely because I'm not sure of the value that the Thermal Club race had, particularly for IndyCar fans. There's been quite a lot of opinion and things written about it since it took place a week or so ago, and it doesn't, for me at least, it doesn't seem to align particularly well with IndyCar, as you rightly say, is a very popular motorsport in the US, and it's pretty well attended. They get generally quite good numbers. Obviously, the Indy 500 is the flagship race of that series and one of the most famous races in any motorsport throughout history. But I think there's a real opportunity for IndyCar to ultimately steal some fans away from F1, particularly as you've said, F1 is still growing in the US, but as it's not perhaps as competitive as it was 2 or 3 years ago, IndyCar on paper has a lot of things going for it. It is a very competitive series. There's some well-known drivers in there, not just from US motorsport, but from, there's Romain Grosjean, Marcus Ericsson, some ex-F1 names for people that are, more familiar with F1 to kind of get behind and support if they want to. The whole Thermal Club event, the fact that it was essentially behind closed doors, not really with much fan attendance. It was held at this country club, as you say, where you have to be a multi-millionaire to even get in. I'm not sure it really paints IndyCar or motorsport in the best light. To me, it kind of goes back to those days of motorsport being very elitist and inaccessible for the average fan. So I suppose, you can't knock IndyCar necessarily for the ambition in trying to mix things up a little bit. And they did that with the race formats as well, which again, to be honest, didn't really work that well. But I think the execution on this time needs some work. I think, it was an interesting experiment, but most of what I've read since reviewing it has tended to be slightly more on the negative side. I guess the one positive that could come from it, and the time will tell if this works, is, if they're hosting it at a multi-million-dollar country club for all of these very rich individuals and putting it on as a showcase for the sport in a bid to win more partners and more sponsors, perhaps, it could work for that from the individuals that were there. But if not, then I think it might be something that needs a little bit of a rethink.
Yeah, I was just looking at the membership fee, and it is 5 million US to be a member. So maybe
Easy.
I'm not the target audience.
No, me neither. Trust me.
No, not yet. Come on, never say never. I mean, capitalism. So, I mean, another thing that IndyCar does, which is, almost similar, but it seems much more accessible, is that at Iowa for the last couple of seasons, and I don't know if it was because of COVID at first, they have 2 races in a weekend, and they put on sort of gigs on sort of the Saturday and the Sunday. And so it's like a short oval. I think they do 250 or 300 miles on one day and then the other half on the other. It's 2 separate races, but I think it's all about the fan experience. And as you say, a lot of it comes down to the competitive nature of the racing as well. So perhaps they're just figuring it out. And as you say, learning from your mistakes, might be easier to learn from mistakes than it is from your successes. Who knows?
Exactly, yeah. And perhaps we can give them the benefit of the doubt on that front. But I think it was, definitely, if they're going to recreate something like that, I think that it'll need perhaps a little bit of a rethink. Because you're right, a lot of the other races they run through the season are very well attended. IndyCar generally is not that expensive to go to as a fan, particularly if we pit it up against the Miami Grand Prix, the Vegas Grand Prix, in the F1 world, which is a completely different scenario. So I think it's fair enough, IndyCar wanting to try and innovate and wanting to try something a little bit different, but I'm not sure hosting a non-championship race at a millionaire's country club was necessarily the way to go.
Just try to reach the everyday working Joe.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of large sums of money, and this will probably be the final sort of news story we look at. I'm on Blackbook.com, I think it is. Yeah, I'm looking at Liberty Media's acquisition of MotoGP for 4.2 billion euros. So we're talking in different currency. So there's been a bit, I'm probably sucked in too much to the F1 Twitter world, where we probably skate thin on facts, but very thick on opinions. So I'm looking here to see that there's a bit of a mixed reaction online, but Liberty has essentially bought out the media company that had the commercial rights for MotoGP. Again, I suppose if you're thinking big picture, Liberty now will own the premier motorcycling sort of category and I guess what they call the sort of the elite category of single-seater racing or motorsport in the world. So do you see immediately kind of a value proposition here or opportunities? Is it obvious to you why Liberty will have done this? Is it to boost the value of their existing assets, or perhaps they saw MotoGP as undervalued? Any thoughts initially on this deal?
So I think, and it is, as you rightly say, probably one of the biggest stories, certainly of the last, kind of couple of weeks in motorsport, and it will inevitably continue to be for a while. I think what's clear is if Liberty are buying, the majority stake in Dorna that run MotoGP, they clearly see potential in the series. They clearly feel that it has some untapped value, and I can definitely see why they would think that. It is a very competitive series. If we're just looking on track, the racing is incredibly exciting. MotoGP has always had a very loyal and committed and knowledgeable fan base. Bike racing in general, but particularly MotoGP, is known across motorsport for having some of the most loyal and passionate fans of any series. So there's definitely a very strong base to build that from. They've been doing some quite interesting things, really, with regards to welcoming in a US team, for example. So Trackhouse Racing, that ordinarily race in NASCAR, have joined the MotoGP grid for this year. So kind of embracing, that American market in a way that F1 perhaps isn't at the moment, certainly not where the teams are concerned. They race in a lot of markets where a lot of other major series don't. So I think there's a lot of potential there for MotoGP. I think it'll be really interesting to see, if the deal does go through, the approach that Liberty take, and whether it is, a kind of copy and paste from when they took over F1 and opened it up to the media. And of course, there was a very well-known Netflix series that came off the back of it, or whether they take a different approach. But I think there's potential there for MotoGP. And as you say, it'll be interesting to see whether they can balance owning the Premier four-wheel series and the Premier two-wheel series together and growing them in harmony, or whether that causes complications further down the line.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm reading more into it on your website, and I can see that while they're acquiring a majority stake in Dorna, it suggests that they are, is it Dorna or Dorma? Dorna are going to remain independent. So I wonder if, I mean, I don't know how independent you can be if you're owned by Liberty or a particular company, but I wonder if at first it isn't going to be just an immediate shift to, okay, we're going to do joint weekends and the same strategy. Thinking about MotoGP, I don't know if it's the same for you, but I used to watch it a lot, maybe about 15 years ago, certainly when Valentino Rossi was winning. And I don't know what it was, but I'd sort of fallen out of love with it. But I always remember thinking it was very much dominated by sort of Southern Europe, Spanish and Italian riders and teams. So I happened to just quickly have a glance at their standings, and it is still the case. Do you see in all of these acquisitions and partnerships and sports, whether it is a battle for certain territories? Are they looking to perhaps reach a new audience that is more heavily concentrated in that part of the world, or is it about getting it from that part of the world and growing it globally, as you suggested previously?
I think more so because of the strength, and as you very rightly say, MotoGP has traditionally been a very European-heavy series, particularly Spain and Italy, where a lot of the teams, a lot of the riders are from. I think because of the strength of the fan base that it has, particularly in Europe, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be looking to expand it from there. I think a lot of the races do still take place in Europe, but elsewhere, they already race in the US at the Circuit of the Americas. They race in India, they race in the Philippines, they race in Thailand. So there's a lot outside of Europe for MotoGP already. But I think having that core European fan base will give them a good platform to then move further afield. And it's interesting you say about kind of your support tailing off since Valentino Rossi retired. Trust me, you are absolutely not alone in that. It's fascinating to see, if we look at the kind of social media following of the drivers, and this is, I think, one area that Liberty will definitely look to encourage. We've seen it in F1 how obviously the personalities of the drivers have just skyrocketed particularly since Drive to Survive, but that helps fans engage much more closely with the sport if they feel they can relate to the personalities in it, particularly if they're ordinarily, behind a helmet. The MotoGP riders, you've got Marc Marquez, who is by far and away the most well-known and well-followed rider on the grid. He has not far off the combined total social media follows of all the other riders put together, which is a bit nuts. But then if you go and look at Valentino Rossi, he is still over double Marc Marquez in terms of social media followers. So I think there is still a little bit of a Valentino Rossi hangover with the sport. And I think one thing that Liberty will likely need to do is work out how they can bring some of the personalities on the grid now, particularly some of the younger riders, through to be that next generation in a post Valentino Rossi era.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose if you're looking at Formula One as a prototype for what might happen with MotoGP, It's not that long ago, maybe 10 years ago, that Lewis, maybe less, I don't know, Lewis got told off for sharing some telemetry, maybe by his team, I don't know, on social media. But there was Bernie Ecclestone kept a very tight lid on use of social media by teams and certainly by drivers. And yet you see now, as you say, it's a core part of the broadcast, let alone what people are permitted to do. I mean, it's extremely interesting what you say about Valentino Rossi as well, having double the fan base. I suppose it's a bit like Lewis Hamilton. I don't want to say this is definitely true, but last time I paid attention, I think he may have had more followers on social media than Formula One itself. But that could just be me being a massive Lewis Hamilton fan and lying. So do fact check me if you're listening at home to that.
No, I have a feeling that rings a bell with me as well. I have a feeling you might be right.
Yeah, although you can see, Liberty Media and the sport as a whole definitely trying to invest in some more names and let's look out on Netflix in a couple of years for Ride to Survive. I can't take
Very
credit for
good.
that.
Very
Yeah,
good.
exactly. Georgie's won that one. Okay, so we're on the home stretch, and I think let's return to you for a little bit before we close. Clearly, you've worked in advertising, having graduated from uni, and you've made a conscious choice to sort of enter the motorsport business. And as you were suggesting earlier, perhaps not something you want to do just because you're a fan, but also because you find the work interesting. So could you give, what piece of advice would you give to someone listening at home that is in a similar situation to you? They've got some sort of professional skills, and they're now sort of intrigued in making that switch. What advice would you give them?
So I think potentially two things, and I would caveat both of these by saying that I am still very early in my motorsport career. But I would say, firstly, it is, and this is a piece of advice I was given when I was, speaking to people in the industry and getting a lay of the land for different parts of it, and that is absolutely lean on your professional skills first. It particularly in a world now where F1 has become one of the most fashionable and popular sports in the world. It is not enough, and in many ways might be a kind of turn off to people if you just come across as a huge fan. You have to lean on the professional skills you have first and foremost, and then, as with any job, if you can back that up with a genuine interest, then that can be seen as a bonus. But just wanting to work in F1 because you're a fan, it's been said to me, and I would agree that is very unlikely to work. So I think assessing the skills you have and how they can be applied to the relevant roles in motorsport that you're wanting to apply to is a much better way of going about it, rather than just coming across as a huge fan and you want to work in F1 because it's really cool. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, which is not, groundbreaking in any way, it's the same in any industry, but just try and reach out and speak to people. Try and, whether that doesn't necessarily need to be someone you're necessarily looking to hire you, it can be someone looking just for a bit of advice or to ask a few questions about the industry or whatever it might be. I think you never know where those kind of connections further down the line can take you. I think it is, on the whole, a very relationship-driven industry, which is just as well, because otherwise, as Blackbook, that is very much what we rely on. So I think, if you can reach out to people, even if it's just having a quick 5-minute chat on the phone with someone, so they might remember your name further down the line, then I'd say that's absolutely worth doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that I've come to realize later in my career is, and I'm not as old as that statement makes me sound, is that, you would always help someone if they were asking you a question. I mean, unless they asked you a million questions, but you would always try and help. But I often found I'd always be nervous to ask for help or be the one to reach out. So, I suppose apply your own standards and assume in the first instance that the person's going to be helpful. So without sending a deluge of listeners in your direction necessarily, where can people find you? Have you got a social media of preference, or is it LinkedIn, or sort of where can people keep tabs on your progress?
It's mainly LinkedIn, yeah. Certainly where Blackbook is concerned, as you say, whether it's through the Blackbook LinkedIn, obviously my kind of individual page as well. Yeah, as you say, that's, I would say, the best place. I'm on Instagram as well, but I think, as you threatened with questioning about earlier, that's more where I'm chatting about London pubs and other things like that. So I'd say LinkedIn would be best.
So, speaking of London pubs, right? And I realized that the question I just asked you is, where can people find you? So you don't have to pick a pub that people will find you in, because that's weird. And please don't do that. But have you got a top 3 London pubs, or even the top one? What would you recommend if someone's visiting London, and also if someone lived in London and perhaps they need to find a new local? Go on.
It's a very difficult question to be asked, which is, your top recommendation for a pub in London, because there are thousands of them. I would say I can throw two out there, if I may. One of them, which is very well known, but is absolutely worth a visit if you've never been, is the Old Cheshire Cheese. It's around it's on Fleet Street. It's near, kind of heading towards the city, and it's just an absolute cavern of cellars. It's been there 500-600 years. One of these pubs that you can kind of descend down 3-4 levels below the earth, and before you know it, you might go in there on a Saturday lunchtime, and by the time you come out, it feels like Tuesday. So that's one. And then also a little one in the middle of Soho is a pub called the Old Coffee House, which is a little bit out of place. It's kind of at the bottom it's in between Regent Street and Carnaby Street, but it's a very traditional, very old school pub, let's say, in an area of London that you necessarily wouldn't expect it to be, given how touristy and busy it is around there. So if I had to pick two, I'd go with those two.
Very good. So Old Coffee House in Soho and Ye Olde Cheshire Cheese. I've not been to either of those. So, I need to up my pub game. I'm very retail.
Add them to your list.
I'm more of I'm a boring guy. I don't like cartoons on my beer, and I just could do with a late 90s European lager and just leave me to it. So yeah, I definitely.
Well, in that case, the Old Coffee House will definitely be the pub for you.
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, someone might find me in there if they can reveal my identity. Brilliant. That's not a challenge out there. Don't challenge. Okay, so before we go, any final message to our listeners before I ask the most fundamental,
the most important question of all? I wouldn't say so. Like I said, I'd very much appreciate asking me to join you. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully people have found at least some of the things I say to be semi-interesting.
No, we have, and I'm sure that people at home will agree. So if you have found things at least semi-interesting, which is definitely a good benchmark to go with, because you can't say no to that, do give us a thumbs up, a like, or a 5-star review wherever you are, and comment otherwise. All engagement's good engagement, sort of. Okay, so on to the final question. And the setup, which I'm going to retire this because I've never had someone say no, but I presume on occasion you've been known to enjoy the odd pizza.
Yes, I'm a pizza fan.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. A pizza aficionado. Okay. So pineapple on pizza, yes or no?
If you'd have asked me a week ago, I'd have said definitely not. However, strangely, last Friday I did, through some sequence of events, end up having pineapple on a pizza, and you know what, it wasn't that bad.
Wow. Okay. It seems like Georgie is tapping up our guests 1 week in advance and tricking them into. How many beers had you had at this point? That's the question, really.
I don't think I'd had any.
Ooh.
I don't think I'd had any.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, I can't quite remember exactly how it came to be that I had a pineapple pizza in front of me, but it wasn't that bad.
All right, well, one for the Georgie Club. I'm me, Mario Andretti, all the great people. We're staunchly anti-pineapple, but it's fine. Each live and let live. Each their own. It's fine. Georgie, you win again. All right. Well, look. On that slightly offensive note, Tom, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the show. I hope you have a fun rest of the evening, enjoying the daylight savings, although it is now dark. And so, if you're at home, you've made it this far through the episode, don't forget to come and find us at Strip the Dip on all reputable social media sites. Until next time, I've been your host, F1 Blag. Good night.